All right. Well,
This meeting is being recorded.
perfect. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am pleased to introduce you to Atmosphere's author event this afternoon. We will be highlighting 3 different novels, each of which use historical time periods throughout history to tell speculative stories, whether that's reaching into the past to tell alternative timelines or ideas, or using the past as a way to reflect on or predict the future. Today, we will hear from Brant Vickers reading from Culver City, released September 27th, 2022. James P. Wollak reading from Distress and Determination, The Trials of Frederick Darcy, Young Gentleman, which was released December 1st, 2022. And Betsy L. Ross reading from The Bones of the World, released February 21st, 2023. All 3 authors' books can be purchased from online retailers and select bookstores. And of course, you can order the books from Atmosphere Press's website at atmospherepress.com/books. Please see the links that I will drop in the chat. At the end of this event, we will have time for audience questions. So during the readings, if you have a question for one or more of our authors, you can type it in the chat and I will make sure it gets asked. But during the reading itself, please stay muted so we can keep extraneous sound at a minimum. Of course, you can always use the chat for any praise and comments. And one last note before we get started, we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it, so feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Brant, Jim, and Betsy this afternoon. Let's start off with our first reader, who is Brant Vickers. Brant started out as a caddy and then delivered flowers before going into the military, living in 3 foreign countries and 7 states. He later found his true profession and vocation teaching students with special needs, some of the most endearing, sweet, loving people on the planet. He is the author of Chucky's in Tucson and Fedor. Brant lives in Arizona with his wife, Cheryl Ann, and their pampered cats. His favorite thing now is writing stories for young adults. Culver City is Brant's 3rd book and one that appeals to both YA and adult audiences. On a hot July night in 1969, Cassidy and Kyle sneak into one of MGM's magical, surreal backlots. Exploring the astonishing decrepit sets, they encounter actors long dead and forgotten decaying movie sets. This leads to phenomena of paranormal experiences beyond anything they could have imagined. And with that, Brant, you're on.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay. I want to say this story invokes a lost period in time that could have only happened in one place in the entire world, and that is Culver City, California. Cassidy and Kyle sat in the limbs of the oak tree in the dark over Alinda Street without talking for a minute or two, catching their breath. "What was that?" Cassidy finally asked. He was still panting. "What do you think?" "I don't know," Kyle answered between breaths. "We'll figure it out in the morning." "Did you see what happened to Lucas?" Cassidy asked. "I don't know, but I'm sure he got away." Cassidy didn't cease with his questions. "Did John and Davy keep up with Lucas? Could they keep up? Did they see what we saw?" "I don't know," Kyle said for the 3rd time. He didn't want to talk about it right now. The air weighed heavily on both of them, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. "This should have been a simple night sneaking into the back lot," Cassidy said. "We won't be able to find the brothers or Lucas right now. Let's go home and end this night." "I'll go first," Kyle said before Cassidy could respond with more questions. Cassidy was sure they could handle climbing out further on the limb. They'd done this kind of thing a million times before. As long as you rolled with the fall and didn't twist an ankle, you'd be fine. Kyle climbed out on the branch, looked Cassidy in the eyes, nodded, and dropped. The instant he hit the ground, the lights on an unmarked police car about a half a block away exploded with red and blue flashing lights, and the car peeled rubber, driving straight toward Kyle. While sprinting toward Marietta Avenue, Kyle furtively glanced back over his shoulder at Cassidy, watched in dread while the cop flew by, squealing its tires while rounding the corner Kyle had run up seconds before. Now alone in the tree, Cassidy couldn't believe a cop was right there. He was by himself in the monster tree at the far end of the back lot. He had to think fast, drop down now that the cop was after Kyle, and wait and watch for a while, or the one thing he didn't want to contemplate, go back through the back lot by himself. The cops could be anywhere, and any car in the dark street could be another cop. He couldn't compel himself to take the chance. The situation was crazy. If the cops caught Kyle and called his mom, she would call Cassidy's mom. She would then have to check the bedroom and realize Lucas was missing. And he didn't even want to think about the brothers. The whole thing had him babbling in his own head. They had always debated the likelihood that the authorities couldn't do much to a couple of kids only 14 and 15 years old for sneaking into one of MGM's back lots. He could circle back down home toward Washington Boulevard. He knew plenty of places to duck and hide from cops along the way. What was usually incredibly fun, comfortable, and familiar territory turned sinister and strange. It looked like the best choice was to go back through the place that had sent the five of them running terrified a short time ago. Contemplating this gave him the chills. Cassidy looked up and down the street one last time. He couldn't see or hear anything except the rustling trees. He climbed back down the oak tree into the back lot and dropped to the ground. The cottonwood trees towered ominously over him. Usually shielding, they now seemed suffocating. He stopped to listen and couldn't hear a sound in the night. Out toward the sets, it was complete darkness. Cassidy knew the black lot reflected no lights from the surrounding city. The cottonwoods, elms, eucalyptus, and oaks hugged the inside of the fence and blanketed the back lot from the outside world. Cassidy was panicky, even though this place had become like a second home to him and Kyle. He had no choice but to cross through the graveyard and circle back through the European village, then climb the fence back out to Arizona Street and make it to Washington Boulevard. It was the only way to go and not cross the open field in front of the Southern Mansion, and that's where he didn't want to be. He knew he was alone. It only took a couple minutes to get to the graveyard. He moved quickly, staying as near to the ground as he could without crawling. At the arched stone entrance to the graveyard, he stopped. The breeze had died down. He thought about the first days, remembering the discovery of the cemetery and how he and Kyle were so scared and walked so slow, it took what seemed like hours to go even a short distance. The other mansions, towers, manors, and castles loomed in the distance. They were different from the Southern Mansion. They had run across the broken down horror movie set on the second or third day of exploring along with the graveyard. It looked like it should have been haunted, 3 stories high with spiral shutters and huge shadowy Gothic windows. The combination of the events during the night and the idea of crossing the cemetery made Cassidy almost opt to go back and take his chances with the police. He took a deep breath, pushed the gate open, and started running under the archway of the graveyard. He involuntarily closed his eyes and ran, but had to almost immediately open them again so he wouldn't trip. One path led to another. Nothing registered in his brain as he darted between the headstones and gravestones and ran down one path, then another, heading vaguely in what he thought was the right direction to the other side of the back lot. He darted down 3 cobblestone streets and made his way behind the Southern Mansion, skirting the open field in front of it. Cassidy never turned his head to look toward the field that all 5 boys had been running from minutes ago. Soon Cassidy was at the place they normally climbed in and out of the back lot on Arizona Avenue. He stopped and proudly looked around once more. At least I didn't totally panic and freeze, he thought. The breeze had picked up again, and the line of towering trees around the mansion was swaying and making the familiar swishing noise. Cassidy climbed up over the steel fence with its braces on the inside, moved over a foot, and started down the chain link fence on the other side. He thought about Kyle and hoped he was home safe with Lucas. As he was hanging on the fence, ready to drop down the street, he hesitated. As forbidding as this night was, Cassidy couldn't believe their time in the back lot was entirely over. His thoughts leapt from one thing to another. He knew deep within himself he was still drawn to this place, but they had seen what they had seen, both Cassidy and Kyle. Cassidy wanted to know more about what it was they saw and what it meant, and possibly come back, because they had seen a girl floating through a blue mist. He willed the thought to vanish as soon as he hit the ground running. He couldn't think about it now. I'm going to leap forward to where now he's in Kyle's bedroom with Kyle's brother, Lucas. Before they could react, Kyle was already coming through the kitchen pantry and into the bedroom. He'd immediately plopped down on his bed and let out a long sigh. Straight away, Lucas and Kyle both began to pelt him with questions from both sides of the room. Did the cops catch you? What took so long? Did you talk to the cops or something? Kyle smirked, waiting for them to finish their onslaught of questions. As soon as I hit the street, Kyle finally started, I saw a cop car burning rubber in my direction. So I ran up that cross street. I think it's Marietta or something. I ended up on Milton and I barely made it to a crawl space underneath the house when the lights hit above me, but they didn't see me. They knew I was close though, and they parked about 3 houses down and waited. I couldn't go anywhere or really move much. I was afraid they might get out and walk around, but they didn't. They sat there in the car and flashed the spotlight around every once in a while. It must have been crazy uncomfortable squeezed in there, Cassidy said. Yeah, it was. As soon as they pulled away, I waited a few more minutes and then left. What's been happening here? Lucas related the story about how he got home with the brothers. Kyle listened to Lucas but kept glancing over at Cassidy. When Cassidy told him about going through the back lot again alone, Kyle burst out with a question. Did you see anything? No, Cassidy said. That guy we all saw must have left or something. I don't know what happened. What guy? Kyle asked. The guy that Cassidy and I saw in the window, Lucas said. Yeah, the guy in the window, he caused them to run. Cassidy jumped in, nodding vigorously at Kyle, hoping he understood not to bring up the girl or the mist. Kyle got it. He understood that Lucas thought the whole thing was about some guy in the window. Cassidy could tell he had the same reservation about sharing what they had seen. Like Cassidy, he wasn't sure why. Both knew it had been such an intense experience. Everyone would remember what they thought they'd seen. Everybody's experience would be different no matter what they had all seen the same thing, or maybe Cassidy uneasily thought they were meant to see what nobody else was meant to see. The boys got ready for bed. That usually consisted of stripping down to their shorts and lying on top of the covers. In the dead of the summer, it was still too hot for anything else. Kyle and Lucas's bed were across from each other, and Cassidy usually slept on a fold-out at the end of Kyle's bed. After a while, Lucas, on his back, started to fall asleep, and soon his breathing was a soft snore. Is he asleep? Cassidy asked quietly. Yeah, I think so. Wait a second, Kyle answered. Lucas, he whispered. No answer. Lucas, he whispered again. They both knew Lucas was a sound sleeper and rarely woke up without being prodded. He's out, Cassidy said. He said the Goon brothers didn't see anything or think about anything other than they wanted to get out of there and never go back. Makes sense, Kyle said. They didn't see what we saw. Yeah, I know. Was that real, Kyle? What was that? Cassidy whispered. I truly don't have any idea, Cassidy. When we split up from the others and started across the field, it didn't look right. But I didn't see anything right then, did you? No, not until we stopped and looked back. It was too dark, but it felt weird. It even, didn't seem or feel, I guess, natural. I felt it more than saw it at first, but I couldn't place it in my mind. I don't know what I'm trying to say, man. The big southern house looked fresh or new or something. It was shimmering when I saw them. What was that? It was a bluish haze, right? Kyle sat up in bed looking at Cassidy. I didn't really grasp what was going on, but it was like people, but not modern people. Do you think? They were like from another time. It was way too bizarre. We should have waited and watched some more, Cassidy said. It was like I saw them, but not really either. But I didn't feel like I could have handled it another second. But now I feel we should have stayed, at least until we found out what was happening with her. Cassidy, she was floating by us, Kyle said loudly. They both looked over at Lucas and waited a second to see if he had woken up. When they saw Lucas's breathing hadn't changed, Cassidy said, she went right by us. She must have come up from the European village. It looked like she was glowing. I don't know, but I wasn't going to stay after that. And we took off so fast, I don't remember anything until we climbed the tree, Kyle said, smiling nervously. I don't know if I want to know. That was way too freaky. Exhaustion overtook them, and they reluctantly faded off to sleep. In the darkness, Cassidy whispered one more thing, the thing that was on their minds from the moment they were back together, but unspoken until the last possible second. Kyle was about to fall asleep, and he barely heard Cassidy whisper it, but he was too tired to argue or deny the truth in what Cassidy said. Cassidy said slowly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly, we have to go back another night, Kyle. She was so incredibly beautiful. Ta-da.
Thank you so much, Brant. I often wonder, if I were in this situation where I witnessed something that was not quite real life, I suppose, like how would I react? And I feel like this reaction is way more realistic than what you typically see like in the movies or in books. So I'm relating if I were in this position. All right. So reading next is James P. Wollak. A lifelong devotee of Jane Austen and all her works, James works as a financial data analyst and lives in San Francisco, California, a third-generation San Franciscan. He is an avid reader, numismatist, and music lover, enjoying all kinds of music such as classical and opera, Motown and soul, ABBA, Celtic, blues, bluegrass, and Zydeco. He also loves silent and classic Hollywood films and the Poldark, Downton Abbey, and Sanditon series. He is a confirmed Anglophile, and Pride and Prejudice is his favorite novel of all time. In Jim's second novel, Distress and Determination, it's spring 1835. After being sent down from Cambridge, 18-year-old Frederick Darcy struggles to develop confidence in himself, but an unexpected tragedy forces a new role upon him. He is to become the next master of Pemberley. Frederick must learn how to manage a huge estate, cope with the unfortunate choices of wayward siblings, and even survive life-threatening challenges. So take it away, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Hala. And this is going to be a scene from chapter 7, so that's all I'm going to say to start with. Now, the morning after the funeral, Lady Catherine was bustling around Pemberley, preparing to return home to Rosings, but also trying to see as much of the estate as possible, because it would be a long time before her next visit. She was not a dedicated walker like Elizabeth, but even she enjoyed strolling through meticulously planned and manicured gardens, which Pemberley had in abundance. She was making her way around the gardens with her cane and her dependable maid Elspeth. They were passing along the outer wall of an enclosed area of the garden when she heard laughter, and young male laughter at that. She made her way over to the gate, and Elspeth led her inside the enclosure. In the foreground, she saw her great-nephew Frederick sitting on the ground, surrounded by white sheepdogs, large and small. He was nuzzling a playful little puppy with his chin as it squirmed in his arms and laughing as the little dog jumped up to lick his face. He had not seen her, and she had not yet addressed him. The dogs almost stopped her. Lady Catherine could not stand little animals of any kind, and she certainly did not approve of pampering them as pets. Dogs were the worst, filling a great house with their hair, noise, and messes. Cats were not messy, but they were hardly any better because they were much too independent for her taste. Cats could take you or leave you, and Lady Catherine chose to leave them as far away from her as possible. Still, she felt something moving her as she watched the scene in front of her. Something always seemed to move her nowadays, since she'd seen her daughter Anne happily married to Lord Edgar for 20 years. It had turned out that Anne was strong enough to deliver healthy children, and now Lady Catherine had her own grandchildren, along with her many great nephews and nieces. All the happiness and satisfaction she enjoyed now more than made up for the noise and chaos the little children caused as they grew. But they soon learned how to behave around Lady Catherine and not swarm around her skirts. The sight of her dark, handsome great nephew playing with the puppies almost made her smile. Young people in general, and grandchildren, she reflected, will do that. She cleared her throat and strode forward. Good morning, Frederick. Great Aunt Catherine. He quickly put the puppy down and stood up so he could give her a proper bow. He exchanged greetings with her and Elspeth, then shooed 2 other puppies off a stone bench so that they could sit down. Thank you, Frederick. Are you well this morning, Great Aunt Catherine? Yes, I am quite well. She looked him over from head to toe. And how are you faring, great nephew? Secretly, Frederick was relieved he had tried to take more care with his dressing and grooming, though the dogs had rumpled his appearance with their playfulness. Despite the funeral and reception yesterday, he felt well enough, but this was Lady Catherine asking, with her maid in attendance. He did not want to admit any weakness to them, so he only thanked her and told her he felt well himself. Lady Catherine could be quite blind to the value of other people's opinions, but she was very perceptive when she wanted to be. She looked at Frederick again as he stood before her. He did not quail, but despite his mild expression, she saw something in his eyes and knew he was lying. She did not want to accuse him or upset him in any way, as she had done in the past, however, so she had to be careful about what she said next. "You may be wondering why I sought you out this morning," she said. "I certainly did not intend to disturb your recreation, but I did wish to speak with you about something. I hope you do not mind." He seemed surprised and unsure of how to respond. "Of course not, Great Aunt Catherine." He looked attentive, if not eager. "What did you want to talk about?" She wasted no time. "I wanted to tell you how badly all of us, including I myself, feel about this awful tragedy. It is most dreadful, the accident that killed your poor brother Henry. What a terrible misfortune for us all." "Thank you, Great Aunt Catherine." He looked away. "It has been very hard for all of us, especially mother and father." "Yes, so I am aware." She did not wish to comment on how anyone else grieved, especially his mother. She and Darcy's beloved had been on decent and pleasant, if not always smooth terms for 20 years, and Lady Catherine was determined not to roil the waters after recent events. She searched for something else to say, hopefully positive. "As I said, it has been a great shock to everyone. There is pain and anguish in grieving, but there is also dignity and later comfort. So it is with your mother and with all of us." Frederick mumbled something and passed a hand over his eyes. Lady Catherine looked away and waited. "You will feel happy again," she said finally. "We all will. Henry's death will not blight us forever." "I know you are correct, Great Aunt Catherine." His voice shook a little. "Father said something similar." He let out a deep breath and tried to smile. "Time is supposed to heal everything, isn't it?" He picked up a puppy and started stroking its fluffy coat. "Yes, it does," she agreed. After a slight pause, she added, "Are there other things that are presently weighing on your mind, great nephew?" He looked around before answering. He didn't want to answer, but could not ignore her question. He finally returned his gaze, tilted his head, and replied, "I have very large shoes to fill." She understood all he was facing, but she would not pamper him even now. "Yes, you do, Frederick," she said evenly. I don't know if I can take Henry's place." She surprised him by chuckling. "Of course you can, great nephew. You're a Darcy, like your father and your brother." She grew serious again. "And you must take his place." He flinched and cried out, "Why can I not have a choice? Why must I do this now? I've been told I could choose what direction I wanted to take in life, but now I'm to be master of Pemberley." So that was it. His tone surprised her, but she did not scold him. "Is that such a terrible fate? Look at the fine man your father is, and how he manages Pemberley, how well he is regarded by the great and common people alike." She shook her head. "You are his next eldest son, so you will eventually become master and keep this magnificent estate running as well as your father does." Elspeth was giving him sympathetic looks. "Yes, father is a fine man." Frederick sounded miserable. "But my future has now been determined for me. I wanted to choose for myself." He shot her a desperate glance. "Now I cannot. I do not know if I am as talented as Henry." He gulped and looked down. "I do not want to disappoint father." "You will not," she told him. "I can see how intelligent you are. Frederick, please listen to me. No son of Fitzwilliam Darcy and grandson of my dear sister Lady Anne will be a disappointment or failure to anyone. Not Henry, if he had lived, not you, and not your younger brother." He still looked stressed and could barely manage to thank her. In her younger days, she would have taken him by the shoulders and shaken some sense into him. How could a Darcy be so lacking in confidence? However, she was a little more patient now and remembered how Darcy himself had changed in 5 years from a shy, awkward boy into a fine young man. She knew Frederick, who looked so much like him, could do the same. Now she tried to be firm, but not overbearing. "You must believe in yourself, Frederick. No one else can do that for you, not forever. You will struggle most needlessly throughout your life unless you do. He nodded and gulped again. Mother told me that as well. I meant no disrespect to Father or to Pemberley. I know how fortunate I am to have both of them and live here. I have even begun attending the university. He looked almost sullen. I just wanted to decide for myself what profession I would pursue as a man. I see, Lady Catherine said. She did understand, but tried to help him face facts. Someone still needs to be the next master at Pemberley, and now that person is you. She smiled and reached over to touch his arm. You will be a fine man, I know you will. I believe you will become a great man because of it, a greater man than you would have become as an officer, scholar, or mere gentleman squire, and owner of an estate that would not be Pemberley, the fun enough. His expression lightened some at her words, and she decided to give him the gift of something personal, an admission. All this talk of choices, great nephew, she continued. Yes, on the one hand, it is very attractive to talk about freedom and think that you can do anything you please. There are a few people who can truly do so. She looked at him. Such freedom is for monarchs or itinerants and vagabonds, not for a gentleman like your father, or even those who honestly earn their living in trade. She thumped her cane. As far as I'm concerned, you can have freedom. You know that I admire those who perform their duties and carry out their responsibilities. He nodded. Yes, I can see that you think your path has been determined for you. No more choices for you, it seems. But do you think I was ever able to go off and do exactly as I pleased? He stared at her. No, Frederick, I was not able to. Not how you mean. Nor did your grandmother, Lady Anne. We were raised to marry well within or above our station and provide our husbands with heirs. She gave him a sidelong glance. I am very happy with my long life, my husband, my daughter, and now her own family with Lord Edgar. I have grandchildren of my own. There were times, however, when I simply wanted to be the lady of the manor and do whatever I wanted, with no husband or children to take up my time. Yet I did marry and marry well and achieve great satisfaction from it. She blinked. At first, and even for a long time, I could not do as I wished. As fortunate as I was in marriage with Sir Lewis. I had to raise and care for Anne until she married or lived no longer. Then I finally did get what I desired after my husband passed away when Anne married Lord Edgar. Now I truly am the lady of the manor, magnificent Rosings Park, of course. And thanks to the generosity of Anne and Edgar, I am still living there and can do what I please. Of course, it helps to have reached my current age, for no one dares to cross me or deny me my will. Chuckling, she patted his knee. You will do fine, Frederick, and you will become a fine master like your father. I know it. Just study hard at university and follow his lead, and you will be as successful and beloved as he. Even more so, I dare say. He surprised her by kissing her wrinkled cheek. Thank you, great Aunt Catherine. She put an arm around him as Elspeth smiled. You are most welcome. I only ask that you keep what I told you to yourself. I cannot have anyone thinking Lady Catherine de Bourgh wanted to shirk her role and responsibilities in life. And Elspeth is the very soul of discretion. Her kindly maid smiled again and nodded. It will be our special little secret. Agreed? Agreed. She rose and he followed suit. She and Elspeth took their leave, but she turned back to look at him before she left the walled garden. Frederick once again was playing with the dogs, and the puppies were playfully attacking him. He sat on the ground with his back against the bench as the little dogs swarmed over him, and he was laughing again. She nodded, satisfied, and continued her walk around the grounds. Okay, that concludes my part of the reading, so I'll turn it back over to Hala.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. Maybe this is a personal opinion, but I would say bookending a scene with playful puppies and dogs is just the perfect way to do it. So that was just a big roller coaster, but a great way to start and end. All right. So our final reader for today is Betsy L. Ross. Betsy is a writer, filmmaker, and happily retired attorney. She's published nonfiction, poetry, book reviews, and wrote the documentary Looking for David about the death of her son from an opioid overdose, available on Amazon Prime. She currently lives in Boise, Idaho, but The Bones of the World was conceived and written in longtime home Salt Lake City, short-time residence Fredericksburg in Texas, and Boise, as she and her partner searched for their retirement home. Born and raised in New Orleans, she studied literature and philosophy as a Plan II major at the University of Texas, comparative literature at Indiana University, and creative writing at the Sewanee School of Letters. This is her first novel. Learn more at BetsyLRoss.com. When Rachel finds herself hiding from the righteous in a mansion next to an enchanted cemetery, she begins her journey to its center. The journey will take her back in history to Soraya, a young woman whose status during the Inquisition is doubly marred as both a Jew and as a lesbian, and to Jacob, a teenage boy who spends the Holocaust hidden in a farmhouse where he plans his revenge in the only way he can. Back in the present, in the cemetery, the Jewish children murdered by the righteous wait for their stories to be told. Betsy, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Hela. Let me start by just saying how much I enjoyed both Brant and Jim's readings, as I'm sure you did too. So kudos to you too. So there are 3 time periods in my novel, and I'm going to read just a little bit from each, hopefully not long enough to bore you, but here I go. The first is set in the near future, and it's going to be an excerpt involving the character Mara, who's having a conversation with her friend Kate. Mara has been said to be by some the great villain of the novel. Mara found herself in a situation she would never have anticipated. First, she was having an affair with a married man, though that wasn't what surprised her, as she had had other affairs when her husband Herb was still alive. No, that didn't cause her a moment's concern. It was that it was with Henry. All those trips together with Henry's in-laws, Ava and William. Even she had some sense of propriety. An affair with their daughter's husband might just be the other side of appropriate. Henry was a good-looking man, but he was also, well, admit it, he was married to a Jew. The friendship hadn't bothered Herb, who had known William since they'd attended MBA school together, and who had become William and Ava's private banker. Let's face it, if you're a private banker, you have to at least pretend broad-mindedness, as a large portion of your clientele is bound to be Jewish. She'd gone along and had even become friends with Ava, though they weren't good friends, were they? And now? Well, initially, it was Henry's loneliness that reached out to her. Rachel, his wife, often seemed distant, somewhere else. Mara offered Henry attention and sex that reminded him of earlier years. But now it was appearing as if the initially illicit nature of their relationship might evolve into something more. If she played her cards right, and with the announcement of the outsider laws, the future was looking more and more promising. Of course, I shouldn't be telling you this, Kate, and I know you'll keep it to yourself, but I had this idea, and I needed to run it by someone, just, to make sure I wasn't going to get myself in trouble. Mara had met Kate for a glass of wine at a popular wine bar far enough away from Mara's neighborhood that no one she knew would see her. Not that she was really worried about being seen. She wasn't, after all, branded with an A on her breast. But the affair was the least of her worries if she followed through with the plan she was cooking up. Oh, do tell, Mara. You live a much more exciting life than I. Old Douglas has become so boring. Kate and Douglas had celebrated their 30th anniversary earlier in the year and had spent it on a cruise to the Caribbean. Maura and Herb would ordinarily have gone with them had Herb not up and died. And under the current circumstances, Maura was unable to bring Henry. But that was the plan she'd called Kate to discuss over wine. Well, this is what I was thinking. You read about the outsider laws recently passed? Oh, I heard something about them. I felt horrible, you know. Poor Ava and William. Maura interrupted before Kate could simper further. Oh, hush, Kate. You know you don't really feel sorry for Ava. It's not our fault that she's Jewish or that she's promoted immoral art at the gallery or cheated so many of her customers with her exorbitant prices. You know you agree with me. Well, of course I do, Maura, but it just doesn't seem right when we're talking about a friend. Well, if that's the way you feel about it, I don't think I should be discussing this with you at all. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Friend or not, they're dangerous, Kate. You believe that, don't you? Well, I haven't really thought about, again, Maura interrupted. That's just it. No one is thinking. Well, I am. And I'm thinking I should report Ava and Rachel to the authorities for promoting an exhibit at the gallery of photographs of nude homosexuals. Henry told me about it. Robert Maple Syrup or something. Even Henry is worried it might create a stir. I know he spoke with Rachel, who became indignant and defensive, thinking the government had no right to intimidate their artistic choices. But Maura, I've heard the government has been taking Jews who've been reported, for one reason or another, to a building they're calling the Interrogatorium. Just the name frightens me. Perhaps it should frighten them. This isn't the first time in history that Jews have caused trouble. You know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire. Oh, I just think, Maura, that you shouldn't act hastily. You've heard about the disappearances. How would you feel if, because of your information, Ava and Rachel disappeared? Maura's answer was swift. I would feel that Henry and the gallery could both be mine. Okay, that's Maura. That's the near future. Now I'm going to turn to the Inquisition and read a little bit about Soraya, who's fled Spain and Portugal for Peru with the hopes of leaving the Inquisition horrors behind. The day was cloudless and warm, the cobblestone streets covered in a sticky substance attracting flies. Soraya waved them away as she walked, taking in the atmosphere of the big city. At first glance, Lima reminded Soraya of Lisbon, large and bustling, with ships unloading cargo and carts filled with goods from faraway ports. She remembered her father's trips and the goods he would return with that became her job to weigh, bottle, and shelve. As she walked further, she was drawn towards the many stalls of fruits and vegetables, surrounded by throngs of people and animals, dogs hoping for dropped scraps, and a colorful bird shooed away by a shopkeeper. The similarities quelled some of her fears, though the uncertainty of where she would sleep that night reignited them. The relative safety of an alleyway beckoned Soraya, promising a few moments at least for her to orient herself to her new home. Shouts suddenly accosted her from out of nowhere. Turning in the direction of the clamor, Soraya saw a great crowd surging from the direction she had just traveled, moving as if a roiling creek passed her toward the center of the square, where she could now see there were wooden posts installed in the middle of what looked like straw baskets. Soraya remained in the alley, seeking safety and anonymity and in the shadows. She watched as soldiers marched in columns of 3 ahead of 4 men and 2 women, that she could count who were tied by the hands, barefooted with ragged clothing prodded by rifles. These prisoners, she realized, were being marched to the posts where they would be burned alive, their punishments carried out. She had heard of such events, but never witnessed one. They would be burned, the burnings carried out by the Inquisition against heretics. And I'll skip over now to the last. This would be the Holocaust, and this is a story of Jacob when he is first encountering the farmers where he's hoping to hide during the war from the Germans. While I was dozing on the sofa in the great room covered lightly by a blanket Helga had knitted for Peter, I could hear Wilhelm and Helga talking in the kitchen about what they should do. You've heard the same stories I have, Helga. The Germans are vicious with those who aid runaway Jews. Remember the group of villagers around Chipolov who were burned alive for merely providing food to a Jew? That the burned included an 8-year-old girl and all her innocence cannot be forgiven, nor can it be ignored. I know, Helga responded. I know, Wilhelm. I also know we are charged by Christ with helping our neighbors. Is it for us to decide who is our neighbor and who is not? Oh, if only it were that simple, Wilhelm sighed. Tell me this. If we risk our lives, to whom would our Peter, have when he returns? Could we rely on another to care for him in our absence? Wilhelm continued. And what about the entire barn full of Poles who were set on fire in Rakovka, including families we knew? What was gained by their attempts to follow Christ's charge? Not only were they killed, but the Jews they were hiding were also killed. It's an unwinnable situation. What is the point of putting ourselves at such risk? I could never forgive myself if you were killed or if our actions threatened harm to Peter. A moment passed before she answered. I admit that I'm afraid, Wilhelm. We would be stupid not to be afraid. But if I live my life now in fear, then I believe the Germans have already won. I can't give them a victory they don't deserve, and that I, with all my heart, hope they will be denied. This boy was led to our doorstep. Perhaps it is a test, or perhaps there's no reason at all. I no longer know the patterns of this universe. I can only act from my heart, and my heart says that either way, whether a random occurrence or a test, I know what I must do. My dear husband, whose heart I know and have loved for all those years, you too know what we must do. They discussed my fate, believing I slept. There was a storeroom down some stairs next to the kitchen that they would empty and make into a room for me. The trick would be hiding it so when the Germans came, as they regularly did, looking for runaways, they would not be able to find me. I can create a wall with a hidden door out of some old barnwood, Wilhelm said to Helga, and cover it with shelving for your bottling and storage items. With the task in mind, Wilhelm began to make peace with the decision. I could see them through the kitchen doorway standing and almost shyly embracing as they sealed this solemn vow, this decision to keep me safe. I wondered if they might have believed I was sent to their care in place of the boy they hoped was being cared for by another in Christ's name. That's it.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I feel like you capture all of these different emotions, but using like these cues from the environment as well, and these vastly different settings. So really, kudos to you. So at this point, we have about 13, maybe 15 minutes for our audience Q&A. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it in the chat and I will make sure it gets asked. Authors, that includes if you have particular questions for one another. I do want to start off with a question from me to all three of you. All three of your books have speculative, quote unquote, speculative elements. So I'm just curious to hear, if anything, what draws you to writing in a way that plays on reality without necessarily adhering to it. Maybe Brant, if you want to start us off.
Well, I guess I'd have to go back to, this was one of the first books I wanted to write, when I was in literature classes and creative writing classes. Because my friends and I, as like in the acknowledgments in the book, we actually did that. We lived a couple blocks from MGM Lot 2 and did that. And over the years, whenever I tell somebody that and I say, well, we saw Zorro land and we saw Terra, Gone with the Wind, everybody goes, oh, that's really cool. That was really lucky to be able to run around and do that. And then over a period of time, I thought, well, I want to leave that for my son and maybe even my grandkids. So how do I tell that story? Because if you just tell it, analytically, we did this, we did that, everybody goes, oh, that's really cool, but it's over in a minute or two. So this made me think, like, how can I tell this story? What can I pull in? Because I don't read ghost stories or paranormal, but that's what I tend to write. And then the next one, and like I did with Fedor, I created an imaginary world. So I just thought, well, how can I tell it? And I was just drawn to it. I said, well, I'm going to tell a ghost story. And then I'm going to pull in the gritty realism of growing up in the late 60s and early 70s in Southern California, so this was the only somewhat, and a lot of people don't like the autobiographical aspect of like people's first novels. So I thought, well, I wait until the third thing I wrote, and now it's okay to do it. So I just thought, how can I tell it? And then this stuff just came to me. And, I researched that Vivian Leigh and Leslie Howard were dead. So that they make perfect ghosts. They're actually at that time period dead. So that's what I did. And then I have them meet a whole slew of long dead actors and actresses. So that's how I decided to do it. And the rest of it was just imagination, a lot of stuff I didn't know I could come up with that people have enjoyed. Does that answer it pretty much, kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, definitely. Kind of taking this reality and then spicing it up just to stretch it out a little bit, for sure. Jim, any ideas from you about what draws you to writing in this way that's sort of playing on these characters or the story that you're really interested in?
Sure. I think for me, it just comes from loving Pride and Prejudice so much, as well as some of the other novels Jane Austen wrote, and just loving those characters so much that it wasn't enough once the original novel ended. I simply wanted them to live on in imagination, or as if it was like a movie playing in my head or something, and coming up with things that I could have the characters do and tell a story that hopefully people would find interesting. And that's what did it for me, was just to try to keep it going and yet be true to the original. And again, try to come up with something that hadn't necessarily been done before, not an easy task to do.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of having to, it's almost like you have these confines, but you've also got to break out of these confines. So kind of a paradox almost with the writing. But Betsy, I'd love to hear from you as well, especially sort of jumping around in these different perspectives. And I'm just curious to hear what draws you to that kind of writing style or structure.
Well, I guess I felt like in this novel in particular, it's a very heavy subject matter, and having some magical realism, some speculative elements was a way to to make it easier to read, perhaps, to make it maybe, yeah, a little less heavy. And I am, in any event, attracted myself to magical realism in what I read. And I love the idea of possibilities. So, yeah, that's probably it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it gives this sort of freedom. I will say, for all of you, I'm personally very interested in quote unquote speculative fiction and fantasy, sci-fi, all that kind of stuff. So I just think I totally agree with that, and the sort of possibilities that opens up. We also have now a couple of questions, again, for all three authors, from Casey in the audience. First of all, why did you start writing? Maybe reverse order this time. Betsy, do you have an easy, ready to go answer for that?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think you do what is in your soul, if you could say that. I started writing when I was in second grade, and I still have a copy of that book. It was a real ripoff from Lost in Space, but you know, some of you will remember that. And then, of course, you live your life and you do the other things that you do. And I still wrote, but I didn't have the time to devote to putting together this entire novel until retirement. So it's been a blast.
Mm-hmm. And everyone's got to start somewhere. So I think that's a fantastic place to start with the writing. Okay, what did I say? Reverse order. So now to Jim. Why did you start writing?
Well, I think I just enjoyed reading so much, and it was some of the things that we read in school, and then I got heavily into murder mysteries and detective fiction, and read for decades nothing but. And it was kind of the idea of like, that was a great story. Could I write something like that? Could I come up with a story? And of course, I appreciate Betsy's comment. The stuff I wrote was a ripoff of the Little House books. It was a ripoff of Sherlock Holmes, first attempts and such, which I think I have copies of, but that's where it all came from. And then just the first couple of novels I wrote, I still have those, and they're like really, really bad because I was so young and had very little life experience. So I think Betsy's point is also a good one, that, after some time passes and you have life experiences, you have a lot more to write about, and it's not a ripoff.
The ultimate goal, right? But it's true, I think writers especially, we sort of tend to hunker down and maybe be more on the introverted side of things. So it's really, it's good advice for sure, seeing the world and experiencing things. And Brant, why did you start writing?
Well, I used to pride myself on being like the only literature major that had no desire whatsoever to write, because I was always like, there's F. Scott Fitzgerald on this side and Herman Melville, and I'm going to add exactly what to it. And so I kind of felt like, and I still do feel I'm not a literary writer. That's I don't think an attainable goal for me. And this book, Culver City, well, like I said, I had already explained that I wanted to pass that story on. And that entailed, well, I don't want my son to be embarrassed when he gets it, even if it's just a manuscript. So I started taking writing classes and then telling stories. My first book that actually did very well, Chucky's in Tucson, I somehow said, I'm going to write a story about some of the special ed kids that I'm working with and the experiences, because many parents, and rightfully so, have written books about their son or daughter, that with autism. And I thought, well, I looked and I couldn't find anything about, well, what's it like when you have 12 kids in that classroom and 4 or 5 aides? that's a whole world in itself that's usually hidden in the school district. Very few people even know some of those kids exist. And so my first one was the memoir about my almost 20 years of teaching special ed. And so that just led to one thing to another. And both of them said it turned out to be a really enjoyable enterprise. And I'm not embarrassed anymore about thinking like, oh, maybe I could read something people would want to read.
Yeah, I think that embarrassment is sort of something we're all constantly trying to overcome as writers. So I think that's the most relatable thing you could have possibly said. All right, so we have another question for all three of you. Do you feel like you control the characters and worlds you've created, or have they maybe grown lives of their own at this point? If any of you want to kick off with this question particularly.
I will. No, it gets out of my control very quickly, and the imagination factor that you didn't even know you had kicks in once you start developing the character. And where does it go? Even like this, I took these characters in places where I never had been, and the same thing with Fedor. When people saw that, I mean, even good friends, their phone call, the phone would ring and they'd be like, where did this come from? And I'd go, I really don't know. I can trace it back a little bit, but a lot of it I don't know, and even if I pick it up today, I'll kind of go like, who thought of that? So I think that's the beauty of it and the magic of it.
Totally. Yes. I mean, I have not written a novel, but I can only imagine that must be so satisfying just to know these are such real characters and worlds, and it really does come to life. Betsy or Jim, any other sentiments about that to share? Well, agreeing or disagreeing, maybe?
Oh, no, totally agreeing. And I think that there are actually stories out there looking to find their way into the world. And at some points, I think we all as authors are merely their tools in getting out there, as perhaps mystical as that sounds, and I'm okay if it does sound mystical, because I think it is. I think it's a mystical process.
Definitely. Exceeding to some extent, the vines of reality in the best way, of course. And Jim, I'm curious to hear from you as well.
Well, I'll make it 3. I definitely agree with both Brant and Betsy. It really is true that the characters take on a life of their own. And starting with my story, and then I'll start hearing the characters having a conversation or thinking out loud in my head. And sometimes that can come up with something like, gee, I wish I could work that in somehow into a story. But definitely the characters do take on a life of their own.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm so happy to hear this from all of you, I have to say. And I know we're getting to the hour, or have reached the hour, but I really love this question, so I want to close with this one. From all of you, any advice for young authors? I know it's a big question. Maybe going back to the beginning of this last question order. Brant, any advice for young authors?
Start writing and do what Betsy said. I think Betsy, that's the best way. I mean, I've thought a million times how I wish I had started this when I was, debating everyone about the worthwhile of being a writer, when we're sitting there, delving into Jim Harrison or, some other, because you see that success and it can be almost overwhelming to say, if it doesn't matter whether it's like, Jim reading those classics. And I wanted to ask Jim, though, had he ever been to North Yorkshire? Because I actually had a Jane Austen class in Harrogate, England, and we got to see some of those places, and it was fabulous. But yeah, start writing and just continue writing. And eventually, I think you'll find your way to what you should be writing. But don't wait until you're our age.
No shortcuts here, folks. Just got to start writing.
Right.
And Jim, what about you? Any advice for young writers?
I would agree with what Brant said. I'd also say I was fortunate in the fact that I had writer friends. And so what I'd say is, if you are fortunate enough, to find like a mentor, someone who's, even if they're not published authors themselves, but they write, or they're people with opinions that you trust, is to seek them out and say, well, okay, I wrote, this, it may be 2 or 3 pages of something. What do you think? And just start gathering feedback. And I think that would be helpful. And just to answer Brant's question, no, I have never been fortunate enough to visit any of the Jane Austen sites, except for, I believe there is a plaque tour in, is it Westminster Abbey? I did see that. But anyway, just to answer that question.
Yeah, definitely. Feedback, so helpful. The more you can get, for sure. And Betsy, closing us out, any of your own advice for young writers?
The advice, if I were to give any advice at all, it would be the same whether the writer was young or old, new, or been writing for so long. And I think part of it is related to what the others have said, Brant and Jim, about looking to others for their advice and their help. But I think more than anything else, it's about trusting your heart, and young or old. That would be the biggest thing I could say.
Yes, definitely writing what you want to write. Perfect. It's the perfect advice, I would say. All right. Well, thank you, all 3 of you, so much for being here with us today and sharing your writing, of course, your books, but also this really great advice and your thoughts on these questions. And thank you to the audience, of course, for being here with us to celebrate these incredible writers. Don't forget that you can order Culver City, Distress and Determination, and The Bones of the World from the links in the chat. And please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, to sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. Feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. But other than that, thank you again to Brant, Jim, and Betsy. And that's it. Have a wonderful close to your weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.